last episode left off with a functional work table and a frame that's ready to be enclosed. Now it's time to actually make some strips to put on the frame to create the outer skin of the paddleboard. But before that can happen, I need to come up with a layout plan for the board. Right from the start of this project, I have been jotting down ideas as they came up of what the board could possibly look like. As these ideas developed, I came up with 4 requirements. The first one is a strip orientation that emphasizes the curved shape of the board. Many surfboards are built by first making a flat panel of strips that are usually arranged to be parallel with the center line, and then gluing the entire panel to the frame. This can look nice, but I really prefer the strips to follow the outside curve of the deck. It'll be a lot more work to do it this way, but I'm okay with that. The second requirement is a simple deck layout with some variation in color, but no crazy patterns or anything like that. This was the theme of the kayak I built a few years ago, and I'd like to do something similar with the paddleboard. The third idea is that I'd like to have some very thin stripes to define transition areas between different sections of the deck. The last item, which is completely new, is a bold center stripe. We'll talk about that later. With these ideas in mind, a new sketch came to life. It has a nice red center strip, stripping that follows the outside curve of the board, and a defined standing area that uses wider, darker strips broken up by light colored stripes. There may be some changes along the way, but this is a good basis to get started with. Now let's get some wood and cut it up. I have 3 boards here for the deck of the paddleboard. 2 of them look like they're from the same tree. They're actually book matched. So I'm going to use these for the rails and the outer part of the deck. But what I'm going to do for these is, because I like the look of the face of the board as opposed to the edge of the board, I'm going to rip about a 1/2 inch off each side. I'm going to do that several times, and then I'm going to turn it 90 degrees and cut it again so that I will have this face showing on both sides. So I'm going to make it basically a mirror image. So this will be one rail of the board, this will be the other rail of the board. I'm only going to use about half of each board for that, and then the other half I will use for the deck. I'm going to cut those a little bit wider because they're not going to be as curved as the rails. So let's get going on that. These pieces have made their first pass through the table saw and are cut to 1/2 inch wide for the rails and 3/4 for the deck. I'm making sure to number them with the order that they came off the saw and mark some lines to show how each blank lined up on the original board. Doing this is important to creating the book match look and keeping the grain consistent on the deck. Now that I've done the initial ripping of the board, what I'm going to do now is turn them all 90 degrees and then rip them into 1/4 inch wide strips for both sets. That's going to be the thickness of the skin on the board, basically. Here's the setup for ripping the strips. I'm using 2 feather boards to keep everything tight against the fence and the table. I'm also using some infeed and outfeed rollers to support the strips as they come off the saw. These 20-foot strips are very flexible and are hard to control sometimes, but this setup does pretty well most of the time. Once again, I'm marking each strip to keep everything in order. After many hours of cutting and organizing, I'm fairly sure I have enough strips for the deck. The only thing missing now is the center strip. Let's get into that. As mentioned before, I want to change things up a bit and make the center strip in a bright color. Epoxy immediately came to mind, but it poses some challenges. Epoxy is much heavier than cedar, and it needs to be poured into some sort of mold to define its shape. So with this in mind, here's the plan. The outer dimensions of the center strip will be the same as every other deck strip, and I'll use some maple sides and a very thin cedar strip at the bottom to form a channel to pour the epoxy into. This will keep the pour contained, minimize the volume of epoxy needed, and the maple sides will make a nice dividing line between the red center and the darker deck strips. I cut the required strips and arranged them on the build table against a long plank to act as something to clamp against. The maple and cedar were glued together and clamped down using some scrap strips covered in packing tape to keep things from sticking together. In hindsight, I should have made more of a channel with the tape to contain any spillover, but this method worked out okay in the end. With the wood glue cured, I double-checked that everything was level and started preparing the epoxy. Some red pigment and a pinch of a few other colors went into this batch, and then the whole thing was poured onto the table and floor. I mean, into the channel. After a few days, it was cured, cleaned up, and here's a piece of the final result. I think it came out nice. Now that I have the frame fully prepped for the first strips, I'm ready to glue on the center strip. What I've done is a dry run here. It's not glued yet, but I just wanted to put it in the middle, see how it clamps down and everything. And what I've done is put these blue marks, blue tape, to show exactly, there's one on either side of the center line to show exactly where the center is so that I can get the strip centered. And I'm using pieces of bicycle tube that are cut up into strips and these spring clamps. And I'm stretching the rubber around the strip and then clamping it on, sort of a band clamp that you would buy at a woodworking store. I just don't have any of those, so I made my own. So next I'm going to mix up some epoxy and get this going. I'm using thickened epoxy for this. It's strong, drip-free, and allows enough working time to position and clamp the strip down before coming permanent. Two more items I made at the same time as the center strip were the end blocks. The very ends of the paddleboard are difficult to finish with only strips. Using some sort of block in those places solves this problem and helps to create a clean and finished look. For these blocks, I wanted to continue the red stripe all the way to the extreme ends of the board, as well as use light-colored maple to match the center strip. So I cut some figured maple pieces and used them as the sides of a temporary mold made of scraps covered in tape. The space between the two maple pieces is the same width as the red part of the center stripe. With everything clamped together, the same epoxy was poured into the cavity and allowed to cure. Here's the result. These blocks are very solid and heavy at this point, but a lot of that will be carved away once they're mounted on the paddleboard. So that about does it for this video. In the next episode, there's going to be a lot of stripping, and this thing will finally start looking like a real paddleboard. Stay tuned, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.